The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of History Nebraska. Welcome to the History Nebraska podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. On this episode, we review an article from 1967 written by Roger Welsch. Today, let's look back at the history of the Nebraska Soddy. We all know the story. There was no wood, no stone, no fuel for firing bricks, nothing but shoulder-high grass. Even along the major rivers, there were only occasional cedar groves, low chokecherry and plum brush, and fragile willow wands. It seemed obvious to us then that sod was the only answer to the housing problem. The Indians of eastern Nebraska used sod in constructing their earth lodges, and the Mormons built sod houses at winter camp in 1846, and then all along the Mormon Trail through the Platte Valley. But the techniques and rationale of sod construction are not as simple as that. Too often, we view the products of a past pioneer technology as primitive and crude, when they are in fact quite complex and exacting. Such is the view of those of us who have been born long after the sod house frontier, as Everett Dick so well described it. Because of our ignorance of the techniques involved, we consider sod construction rude and unsatisfactory, a temporary answer to a problem posed in the distant past. Those pioneers among us who well remember the Soddy frequently dismiss the complexities of sod house construction because of their proximity to them. The sod house was too everyday for them to be seen as anything but pedestrian. Building a sod house, however, was more than just merely stacking chunks of, quote, Nebraska marble one atop the other, and pathetic efforts of some Nebraska communities and organizations to build replicas of the sod house graphically bear this out, for few of the imitations match to any degree the durability and polish of the originals. The following descriptions and conclusions about the actual building methods represent a very brief summary of a study based on pioneer accounts and reminiscences, interviews, accounts, and descriptions by historians, examinations of extant soddies, and a computer analysis of 800 sod house photographs. First, I would like to describe the techniques used in building a sod house, but of course, because of space limitations, I can treat only the most common forms and not the many variants and subtypes. In different parts of the plains and under different conditions, in the hands of various craftsmen, sod construction techniques varied a good deal, as do all folk forms. But in short, most Nebraska sod houses were built in the following manner. The site for the house was cleared of grass and brush and leveled with a spade. Holes were filled with loose earth, and the floor area, usually a rectangle about 14 by 16 feet, was tampered concrete hard with a fence post or wagon tongue. Very few homes enjoyed more of a foundation than this. The walls were usually aligned straight north and south, east and west, with the help of the North Star on a clear night. A good stand of slough grass or buffalo grass was found for the wall sods. If the sodbuster had a choice, he built in the fall when the prairie grasses were wire tough and woody, yet at a time when the ground was moist enough to hold the soil firmly to the sod bricks when they were lifted to the wagon box or stone boat bed. If the grass was high, like big blue stem, he might mow it first, saving the cut grass for roof thatch. Occasionally, the sod, about 1 acre for the average house, was cut in one direction with the cultivator equipped with vertical knives and then plowed in the other direction so that the sods came out ready cut to size. But usually the sod was cut in long, solid ribbon and then hacked into blocks about 2 feet by 3 feet by 3 or 4 inches with a sharp spade. The standard walking plow, a turning plow, could not be used, for its purpose was to tumble the soil and destroy the root mat. A breaking plow, or grasshopper plow, shaved off the 3-inch ribbon lifted from the prairie on iron rods and then gently rolled it over unbroken. Although horses were the most common draft animal, oxen were generally preferred for sod cutting, for they pulled more slowly and evenly. Homesteaders have told me that as the plow slashed through the virgin sod, it sounded like the opening of a giant zipper. At the house site, the sod were laid without mortar, grassed down like huge bricks. In fact, in many areas, sod houses were called brick houses. The walls were 2 or 3 sods thick, and each sod was set behind the others so that the joints were staggered to discourage invasion by unwelcome guests, snakes, mice, or winter winds. Each layer was begun in a corner of the house, and each layer was finished before the next was begun. Each sod was also put atop the others with staggering joints. Every third or fourth layer was set crosswise on the vertical piles. This binding course added substantially to the stability of the walls. As the levels for the window and door sills were reached, the frames, simple, open-ended plank boxes, were propped in place and the walls rose around them. Sometimes 1-inch holes were drilled through the planks, and pegs or dowels were driven through them and into the walls to hold the frames firmly in place. Frequently, the sides of the casements were beveled to permit more light to pass through the thick walls and into the dark, sometimes smoky interior of the house. We dilettantes would probably have just piled our sod directly on top of the window and door casements, but those who learned from tradition knew better. The heavy walls settled 6 or 8 inches in the first year or so, but at the window and door location, where the load was obviously much less, the settling was only 2 or 3 inches. To allow for this difference, to prevent the crushing of the casements, jamming of frames, and breaking of the precious glass panes, usually the most expensive part of the house, the walls were built up 8 inches above both sides of the casement. Then logs or planks were set across, leaving a gap between the window and the wood members bearing the overlying sod. This gap was stuffed with loose rags, paper, or grass, and as the walls settled around the windows, this material was compacted without affecting the windows themselves. These windows were usually commercial, double-hung, 12-pane frames, and the doors were homemade of 3 planks with 2 or 3 cross members. The walls were shaved smooth with a sharp spade, and all holes were filled and tamped. The roof was the proof of the soddy. If it succeeded, the soddy succeeded, and if it failed, and it frequently did, the house almost certainly failed.
From hardly any rain, we soon had more than we needed. Our roof would not stand the heavy downpours that sometimes continued for days at a time, and it would leak from one end to the other. We could keep our beds comparatively dry by drawing them into the middle of the room, directly under the peak of the roof. Sometimes the water would drip on the stove while I was cooking, and I would have to keep tight lids on the skillets to prevent the mud from falling into the food. With my dress pinned up and rubbers on my feet, I waited around until the clouds rolled by. Then we would clean house. Almost everything had to be moved outdoors to dry in the sun. Life is too short to be spent under a sod roof. In June, after the folks were nicely situated in their new one-room soddy, it commenced to rain and continued to rain for 4 days and nights. The roof was laid with willows with sod on them and naturally began to leak. Father said, "Let's get under the table," so we did. The long ridge pole on the roof began to crack from the heavy weight of the wet sod, and finally the roof caved in with the pole resting on the table. We were buried beneath the sod and the muck. Finally, Father saw a little patch of light, and he dug his way out.
But many were not so distressed about the rain falling through the roof because they knew that it was also falling on the fields.
During the last years we lived in our sod house, it got pretty leaky. We were so glad for the good rains that caused us to have to get up and put dishpans, washpans, tubs, skillets under the drips that we did not mind. My dad used to say those drips played a regular tune with a soprano, alto, tenor, and bass in the harmony.
These problems arose from a misunderstanding of the sod roof. Sod is a superb insulator, but a miserable water repellent. There were 3 standard styles of roof. In order of frequency, the gable roof with 2 surfaces, the hipped roof with 4 surfaces, and the shed roof with 1 surface. There were 2 standard types of roof construction, cut lumber and pole and brush. Cut lumber was obviously the best, but it was also the most expensive and, therefore, less common than pole and brush. The sheathing planks on a cut lumber roof were arranged in various ways, running from gable to gable or from ridge to eave, with and without framework. Then the insulating layer of sod was set over waterproof canvas or tar paper. A pole and brush roof was cheaper, but more complicated. 1 to 7 cedar beams were run from gable to gable. Then, from ridge to eave were run, every 6 to 12 inches, willow poles. On these was spread a layer of blue-stem grass. Next, successful roofs had a waterproof sheet of gypsum plaster or alkali clay from a creek bank or a dry lake bed. Atop this was placed the sod, grass up. Inside, the fancier houses sported a plank floor. These were always the most popular houses for square dances. But this too sometimes caused regrets.
In the spring when we had the big rains, our roof did its share of leaking, and even after the rain was over, it seemed like our roof leaked for another day. Mother often wished that it was reversed, the boards on the roof instead of on the floor.
And so, in 2 or 3 weeks, with an investment of $2 to $12, a sturdy house was built. After waiting several months to permit the walls to settle, the inside walls were plastered with a thick mixture of clay and fine sand. Some were then papered with commercial wallpaper or newspaper. Muslin or canvas was hung from a ceiling to add elegance, to make the interior brighter, and to keep mice, mud, and snakes from dropping onto the bed or into the soup. Construction techniques were therefore more complex than is commonly believed, but this I had expected when I began my study. The real surprises lay in the rationale for the sod house. Why did the Nebraska settlers build sod houses? The obvious and best-known answer, that there was nothing else, is as incomplete as our knowledge of the building techniques. One by one, new answers came to light. For example, when I began to work on this project, I advertised in several central Nebraska newspapers for early settlers who remembered building soddies. I was surprised by the hundreds of replies I got, but I was amazed by the number of letters I got from Nebraskans who still live in sod houses. Hundreds still live in attractive, comfortable 19th century and early 20th century sod houses. The conclusion suggested by this situation was reinforced through interviews with former sod house dwellers and published memories of pioneers.
I think it was a good thing people in those days had sod houses to live in. With no more fuel than they had, they would have frozen in a frame house. Those that had frame houses hauled coal from Grand Island or Kearney. Our dugout was so warm that during the blizzard of 1888, we sat in it and let the fire go out.
Dozens of Solomon Butcher's pictures show a sod house surrounded by board fences, heavy wooden windmills, wooden sheds and cribs, and huge frame barns. Again, the settlers themselves, like Mrs. Hodge in the above statement, verified the fact of the assumption. Repeatedly, pioneer Nebraskans testified to the comfort of the sod house, its suitability to prairie conditions, and the unsuitability of frame construction.
The outbuildings were wood. The barn was covered with tin later on, but the cattle and all animals had winter coats heavy enough to take care of themselves. Some people thought the frame house was not warm enough for a family to live in.
The frame house was painfully vulnerable to prairie fires, severe weather, and wind. Wood burns, warps, leaks, shrinks, swells, rots, and can be eaten by insects and rodents. Sod resists all of these. In addition to the superior quality of sod, there was another reason for its popularity in house construction even after lumber was available and inexpensive: the monument of tradition. Plains houses were sod houses. When one built a house, he built it out of sod, by reason of a regional habit. Just as we continue to build with lumber despite the disadvantages listed above and the ready availability of stone and brick, erecting dangerously flammable cities of wood, Nebraska pioneers continue to build houses of sod out of pure traditional habit. The sod house is a proud and impressive example of pioneer ingenuity, courage, and technology. We are fortunate that many still stand, but we cannot permit ourselves to be satisfied with the shabby and inaccurate parodies that are used around the state for tourist promotion. Instead, the money, effort, and enthusiasm should be directed toward the restoration and preservation of some of the original sod houses that remain. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of History Nebraska, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.